It's not just about becoming sexually sober. It's about healing the relational wounds under that.
This is not hopeless. Like, it feels like it. It feels like it's the end of the world. But the addiction couldn't survive if it didn't convince you of that. Hello and welcome to Brighton's Recovery Soapbox. My name is Cameron Carver and I'm the clinical director here with Brighton Recovery Center. Today I've brought in with me to our podcast some of my dear friends. The first being John Taylor. He works with the Healing Paths Counseling Center. He is the program director there and specializes in an amazing field that is just breaking out into popularity over the last few years in a way that it hasn't quite done before previously. So it's a really exciting place to be. I invited him to come in today and speak a little bit about sex addiction and how it impacts the greater community that he involves himself with, as well as that demographic. And then next to him, we've got Arch Wright. He works with Red Willow Counseling and Recovery and is also a prime representative, I would say, of someone in this demographic who struggles with these kinds of issues that John and his center are a part of as well. And the reason that you're here, quite frankly, is because here at Brighton Recovery Center, when you take away somebody's primary form of self-soothing and coping and their entire way of relating to themselves in the world, and they don't have access to that anymore in a substance, what is the first thing that most people will go to?
Your body.
Yes, your body and other people's bodies. And
yes.
So, we've got that plentifully available in residential treatment centers. So it is kind of prime for that kind of behavior and acting out. And what I like to say is a fused or shifting addiction in a lot of cases. It just becomes really prevalent once we get someone in this kind of an environment. So I think the conversation is going to be equally as powerful from my perspective watching that as it is from yours, both being outpatient clinicians. And we can really just take this and expand on it in our own perspectives and our own experiences. So I'd like if we could just turn the time over to you a little bit and you can talk about yourselves and how you've shown up in this community and what you hope to get out of today as well.
Sure. I'm John, like Cameron said. So I guess I kind of fell into sex addiction work. It wasn't my plan. I mean, who plans to do that work from the time they were a little boy? But I have certified with the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. That means I've worked to understand the ins and outs of what we call process addiction or addictions that don't involve the substance necessarily. As a result of that, I also do a lot of work with trauma and a lot of work with relationships, because when addicts start getting sober, they start realizing why they were addicted in the first place, what they were running from. So do a lot of trauma work and a lot of repairing relationships after addiction. So I also co-host the podcast, Thanks for Sharing, with my colleague Jackie Pack, and we focus on that after sobriety, what comes next in recovery. So really looking at relationships, healing from trauma, becoming a functional adult. And that's kind of what I like to do clinically. So.
And you do it quite well.
Thank you.
Actually, yes, I've referred many clients from here to your center, and the reviews are phenomenal. So
Thanks.
Thank you for the work that you do.
Yeah, I'll support that actually, John. You and Jackie have a national reputation that's very solid for your knowledge and expertise in this area. In fact, I'm very much where you are with your description of what you do today, focusing on relationships and trauma. And how people discover that after often many years of recovery from chemical addiction. My path to where we both are, or all three of us are, with this, because I believe that people will just move from addiction to addiction to addiction, compulsivity, dysfunctional patterns in life until we get down into that underlying trauma and start healing with that. My path is I'm a fairly new clinician, actually just in the last few months, graduated in December with my master's degree. It's a second career. I'm well into midlife. And I'm in recovery for 33 years now from alcohol and drugs, and about 10 to 12 years from sex and love and codependency. And so I've come up through living it. And the path that you just described, John, is exactly what's happened to me in the last 10 years. I've decided to tear off more layers of the onion to get down to why my, most specifically, why my most intimate relationships with my now adult children, when they were turning adolescent, even though I had many, many years of sobriety from chemicals, I was seeing a person in me that I didn't like. I was not parenting with very much effectiveness, a lot of anger and frustration and manipulation. I mean, on any given day, it was who's the kid and who's the parent. Mm-hmm. And yet I was, quote, sober. So I just essentially, my finance career kind of started ending. Maybe it was a higher power thing, I think, at this point, from various economic factors around 2009, and I just said, you know what, I want to do something that matters more, and so I went back to school and just got my master's degree, and I too am on my way to becoming certified sex addiction therapist with ITAP, as John mentioned. I'm in my pretty soon will be my fourth of third training modules, and then I need some additional work experience, and I'll have that certification as well.
Well, I think that the experience and the love that this room holds for the population that we serve is going to speak volumes to what people take away from this discussion today. Not only have you lived it and walked it, but now you're living that 12-step and you're turning around and you're giving it back. And you just happen to be doing that through a therapeutic clinical role, which I think is admirable, and especially following your recovery, being able to say, you know what, finance just isn't it for me. I see that so often, with Brighton, when somebody discharges, we follow them for 6 months afterwards. Mm-hmm. And so I get the amazing opportunity to see what recovery does in a person's life. And I would say a good 80 to 90% of the time, that is the experience. They're waking up and saying, how have I existed at this level in my life for so long? Whether it's a failed relationship or a failed occupation or wanting parental connections to be stronger, the part of the brain that was keeping them from seeing that is now like, this is not okay anymore, mm-hmm. and I need to make a shift. And so that, I think, is a great example as you model that for not only yourself, but your colleagues and everyone who comes to you for support.
Well, it stood out to me, Arch, when you were saying getting sober from substance and then needing to look at the sex and love and codependency. And I think that whole relational package kind of comes together in recovery. Yeah. Because to me, whether it's a process addiction or whether it's a substance addiction, the wound is the same, if not very, very similar. And that's the disconnection we suffered as children, and that disconnect that carried through. And we have to learn whole new rules or whole new ways of connecting with people, because the patterns that we've had mm-hmm. have been so damaging to us. And it's not really something that we, I think, have the luxury of seeing until we come out of that crisis living. Yep. And we can start saying, wait a minute, I think life might be able to offer more, maybe.
Yes.
And then we start looking layer by layer.
Right. Yeah, and I'd add, just hearing you describe that, I'd add, even though this is primarily, I believe, a discussion around sex addiction, money. Mm-hmm. Money ties in there with the greatest of process addiction issues. Yeah. Yes, rarely indeed. Is there a sex addiction / love addiction thing going on where there isn't a money factor that's all tangled up in the midst of it.
Right.
And again, that's all about a relationship, right? And I think money and sex in our society, those are the two things that are tied in with power most directly. And I think that's what a lot of my clients are looking for, not necessarily like dominance, although they may present wanting to dominate everybody and be in charge, but really what they're looking for is some legitimacy and feeling seen and valued and felt in their relationships. and they often try to do that, like with most things in addiction, that comes out pretty sideways, and it can be pretty loud, pretty intrusive, pretty damaging. But what they're looking for is that connection that I think money and sex offer.
Yeah, and that mention of power, interesting that lack of power is our dilemma, is one of the primary, most fundamental statements in the big book of AA, which started this whole 12-step deal, is lack of power is our dilemma. And then it goes on to explain how us alcoholics, when that book was written, we seek power through the wrong sources. We seek it through money and sex and power.
And then what do those give us? They give us the illusion of control. And in every instance, the belief is, oh, I've got this. Like, this is a normal behavior. This isn't on any radar.
And maybe it's even praised, like especially the money stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. You walk into a room of Workaholics Anonymous, there's no shame there.
That's right. It's more trying to instill some shame so we can have some forward movement.
That's
yeah,
funny.
It's true. And I love that you brought up the workaholism piece, because so many workaholics have this as a fused or co-occurring part of their addictive cycle. Because how easy is it to get overwhelmed to the point where, in your workaholism, you can't even focus, and everything is just so overwhelming that it's like toppling over on itself. And how are you going to soothe?
Yeah.
Well, now I've got all this money. I can go, go to clubs, get prostitutes, fly all over the world, and have secret lives, double families. This is just as much of a disease as is any of these substance addictions.
Right, and with the money, if you're making a fair amount of it, you've got a host of people around you that don't want it to stop. So that confrontation and consequences can be, less commonly happening, which is what drives most addicts with other afflictions to recovery. Consequences.
Exactly. Yep.
It's a little trickier with the money piece.
Well, and the sex piece, because the sex piece, for many people, can exist under the surface for years, longer than a substance can, because it doesn't affect the mind like the others do so dramatically and noticeably. So it can look as if things are going much better than they are for much longer, which allows it to exist in that way. And like you said, be praised in some ways. Unless you're a woman, the women get the brunt end of that deal, but the men don't.
Yeah.
The men get to go off and conquer, and it's all normal, and it's all expected and praised.
Women are sluts and the men are studs.
That's right.
Yeah. The exact same behavior. For men is really praised and supported, and for women it's shamed. And I think especially when it comes to sex addiction, that's one of the big inequities we have in recovery. I think even for a man to get into sex addiction recovery, there's shame there. But I think there's a lot more for women to slog through.
Yeah.
And I think it really speaks to, please silence your cell phones.
Who did that?
I was going to say it at the beginning of the podcast, but who doesn't do that?
This is a real moment, though. This
rude.
makes it a very genuine podcast.
Don't cut this out.
It was just my dealer. Sorry.
That's right.
Your pimp.
Yeah, his ears were burning, right?
You got to get me back in check.
So what I was saying before we were so rudely interrupted. But I think what really speaks to what we're talking about here with that double stigma, or I don't even know if that's the right word, but just
The double standard.
Standard, that's what I meant, yes. So what really speaks to the double standard here is the fact that, we reached out, I personally reached out to 4 or 5 different women in recovery with sex addiction to try to get them here today. I know you did as well, reached out to your network, and they're not here. Right. And yet, I had 3 or 4 guys lined up ready to go. Pick the best one, by the way. And they were all ready to just, champion the cause and help their fellow brothers and, get out there and make things happen. And so I think even that says something.
Right.
Yeah.
Just the absence of that representation here as well.
And I think another side of that I've seen with a lot of the female sex and love addicts I've worked with, there's an angle of exploitation that I think is common in both men and women, but in women and sex addiction it's much more pronounced, again, because of how we do gender roles and how our culture works. And so I've seen, like, I think we have a very strong women in sex addiction recovery community here in the state. I think they're actually leading the charge in some ways nationally. But there is, in sex addiction recovery, everybody has to look at the wounds from their same gender and from the opposite gender. And I think for a lot of women, there's been a lot of taking their story and exploiting it. And it's
yes, and then it's a shame-based cycle as well.
Yeah.
Which, before we move on too much further, for those women who are listening today, John's talking about the podcast or the group that currently exists related to Recovering Amy is what she's listed.
The Worth Recovery podcast. That's a must listen for women in any kind of recovery, I think, and men too.
I agree. I've listened to several of what she has to offer and refer people to her conferences when she creates them and brings them to the centers in town. So definitely want people to reach out to that as a resource.
Yeah. I'm really glad you guys brought that up, and that's just such an awesome thing. It's so needed.
It is. And what I'd like to do too is kind of go back to these acronyms that we're using. You know, we've got the sex and love addiction that has come out and the sex addiction. I would really like to have kind of just some psycho ed right now for those who don't know of all those different and varying groups and what needs they serve and how you see them serving different needs in different ways.
Like for the recovery community specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. I think, Arch, you'd be more of an authority on the SLAA. That's the one that I'm least familiar with.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. Of course, by far probably the most efficient way to get a feel is grab their book.
Yep.
The SLAA book is, it's actually, and I'd throw ACA in, which you do have, John. I think quite a bit of experience with that. A lot of people.
Can you throw in the definition?
Oh, too? Yeah. Thank you. Adult Children of Alcoholics.
And then SLAA is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous.
Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. So I would say the Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous versus any number of the strictly S programs. I'm more familiar with SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous. It just adds an emotional component and a romance component and a relationship. I think romance and emotion, and one of the words that's commonly referenced in the SLAA literature and in rooms is romantic intrigue.
Yes, that's where the high is, not so much the sex.
Yeah, and I can speak as an addict here that owned I was in a 24-year marriage, never had any outside sexual activity outside of the marriage, never cheated on my wife, and yet every single day I was in fantasy and had little romantic intrigue things going on with flirtation, and either with women I worked with or with women in our community, or I was fooling myself, and but looking back, people knew it, and it was a way that I was in active addiction and never touched another woman.
Ooh, that's a good thing to bring out.
And so in active addiction, for those people who are listening and understand how critical recovery from a substance, alcohol and drugs is, how critical it is to become mindful and not be off into fantasy and this disillusioned state, I was every bit as much lost and out of the moment with that experience. And I'd say SLAA focuses quite a bit more, if I had to guess, it's probably 70% on that and 30% on sex, behavior. And
it's a really important distinction, because I think the intoxication is really different and the recovery world is really different. We had a client in our clinic several years ago who slept with a lot of other women who weren't his wife, and he wanted to call them affairs, but there was nothing relational about them.
Right, so that's more of an S.
Yeah, that would be more of a sex addiction. Yeah. When in the love addiction, like you said, you can get a high without even touching another person. It's that possibility. It's the hunt. It's the formation of the new relationship where you get the hit. Whereas sex addiction, it's really orgasm focused.
Great point.
Or leading up to orgasm.
Yeah, you guys both know I was fortunate enough to work my last year in my collegiate experience, all last year, 2016, at Gentle Path at the Meadows, the residential sex addiction treatment center.
Yeah, that the founder of our practice started.
Yep, and I worked side by side with him for at least once every couple of weeks. Got to work with Dr. Carnes.
That's awesome.
Yep, and I just remembered one of the patient stories. He had, he probably had 10 relationships going on outside of his marriage that were financially, he owned condominiums for these women around the country, and he was in romantic, and one of them, for 20 years, he would fly, he's obviously a very wealthy man, he would fly the one woman for 20 years. Every time he and his family would go on a vacation somewhere to Hawaii, he would fly her and put her in a neighboring property.
Wow.
And the wife, part of the family disease of addiction, the wife, kind of knew but didn't want to know.
Yeah.
And but for sure there was not the level of intimacy and function in that marriage and family.
Well, because if she knew, she would have to act, and then she would lose her access to what she's getting.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that's something that spouses of, if you're ever just a drug addict, just drug addicts and sex addicts, they share in common. They feel very replaced by the object of obsession for the addict. And that word object is really important, even when other people are involved. I don't think in addiction we see other people with emotions and personalities and needs. We see an object for getting our needs fulfilled.
It's objectification.
Means to an end,
Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit about the SA piece, sex addiction, because that's the one I know the most about. Sex addiction, or sex addicts, in this program, SA, have a very strict guideline for what recovery means. And, like SLAA or even SAA, it's more open. And so with Sexaholics Anonymous, SA is all about you don't know what's best for your brain, and so here we're going to tell you. A lot of people find great comfort in that. They don't have to think.
Really like that structure.
It's like, okay, good, I can be taken care of. I don't have to worry about this. And it's very simple, and it's just laid out. Whereas the SLAA or the SAA programs have more, kind of build your own recovery and versions of sobriety and what that looks like. So I think it has a flip side too. I mean, I think with that rigidity comes a lot of exclusion as well. So some people, like the homosexual community, don't find solace there because they have not accepted the marriage equality aspect of our society's evolutionary process, I guess you could say. And so, those people who need structure but find themselves within that demographic are kind of at a conundrum. They don't really have a lot of places to go unless they kind of recreate that in one of those other S groups. So, just being aware of that distinction and knowing that there are subgroups, especially here in Utah, trying to make it work. They're not able to call themselves full Sexaholics Anonymous members, but they can still function under that same guideline. And some are making it work really well, and some get caught up in it and just can't handle it. So, they're forced into other avenues and other options. But I think it's really important to, have your head on straight and know what you're getting into if you're stepping into one of these meetings.
Well, and it's okay to, I tell my clients, you need to shop some meetings. It's okay to show up and see how it feels and see what you connect with. There's also another S fellowship. It's not huge in the state of Utah. Sexual Compulsives Anonymous.
Yeah.
And that one is a lot more LGBTQ friendly. And so most of these fellowships have phone meetings. And if you are wondering if this is me, is this my story, is this something I need to look into, calling into a phone meeting is just about the least intrusive, safest way you can see if these people are speaking your language, if they're telling your story.
Yeah, that's a great point. And before we began this podcast, I was sharing with Cameron about our Rob Weiss, who's a major authority in this space, international major authority and author and therapist and in sex addiction, sex and love addiction. There's a website called intherooms.com, which has all sorts of different programs. And on Friday night, Mountain Standard Time at 7:00, he does an amazing hour.
It's a Q&A, isn't it?
It is a Q&A, yeah. And he's giving way more than just leading a meeting. He's very forthright with his own recovery.
And makes it very clinical, too.
And makes it very clinical. It's fantastic. I wanted to add also, there's commonly, when I get asked about the S programs, and one of the questions that comes up quite often is about who attends them. And I know as a clinician, often when I was in Arizona last year, we would be working with, in this as an example, a male client, and because of his specific case and issues around relationships, we said, SLAA might be good content-wise, but right now it might not be the best place for you to be.
Not good sobriety-wise.
Triggering in sobriety, because there's, at least in Utah, and I would say based upon other states I've been to meetings, there's a more generous mix of both genders in SLAA than at least I've seen in SAA. I'm not sure about SA. So, obviously, I think the long-term goal of all of this stuff, I think you guys would agree, is healthy sexuality. And so being able to be around men and women and everybody and be secure and comfort is the long-term goal. But if you're a month out of acting out on a really dangerous level, and it's around women, and you go start sitting in a meeting with women sex addicts, it's just something that, as a member of an SLAA group, as I am, and a longer term member, I'm focusing on new men that come in and trying to, if I'm sponsoring them, or just trying to kind of keep an eye on what's going on, even though I can't police it. But and we have things we say in the beginning of the meeting that help guard against that.
Well, and I like what you said too, the whole goal being healthy sexuality, because you've got the movements out there that are so vehemently opposed to the idea that sex can be an addiction. And, it's almost like a war that's going on. And anytime something comes out for porn kills love, or, just the hint that behavior could actually be addictive, you've got this other camp which rises up to be a voice that silences that. And I'm just wondering what your take on that is, because to me, it's the most confusing and baffling, unnecessary argument that this topic could ever entertain.
From talking to folks, and I even hate to say the other camp, because I agree with a lot of what organizations like ASEC, the American Authority on Sex Educators, Counselors, Teachers. I don't even know what the acronym means, but they're kind of
John.
Yeah, they're kind of one of the they're one of the leading organizations in treating sexual issues. I agree with a lot of what they have to say, that sexuality is personally determined. That likely, if you haven't experienced it or you haven't dealt with it, you're not an authority to speak on whether it's good or bad or right or wrong. That's a very individual decision. And as a certified sex addiction therapist, I believe that.
And any well-trained sex addiction therapist would believe that.
Right.
That's what we're trained to do.
Yeah. Right. And so kind of a parallel in my own life, one of my sub-addictions is sugar. And it's not like I like a little bit of sugar. It's like I'm probably a step away from diabetes at any time.
I think I've actually seen that manifest.
I think you have.
Your office has chocolate all over the place.
So I used to
wrappers in your car.
I used to have the wrappers in my car.
It's supposed to be for the clients, Jackie.
Right, I know. The candy bowl used to be right outside my door, and after every session, I'd go and grab 3 or 4 candy bars and I'd wolf them down. So it's interesting to me every time I get serious about exercising, all of a sudden how I want to eat changes. So for the last week and a half, I've been swimming a mile each morning, and so I'm in that magical place where it's sugar's not what I want to snack on. And yesterday at staff meeting, we got Cutler's, and there's really good cookies. I wolfed down the whole cookie because that's what I'm used to, and then I felt dizzy, and I felt
plus you've been swimming, so you can now do it because we'll work it off later.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's the addict's brain.
It's not that I can never eat sugar again. I have a pathological relationship with sugar and I need a break from it to reset and to recalibrate and decide how I want to use it, instead of it just being this automatic thing. Oh, here's this big, delicious, rich cookie. Like, let me throw that down my throat as fast as possible. I think in sex addiction recovery, there may be some periods where abstinence is useful because it helps you to evaluate fully, what does this behavior mean for me? What does it do for me? Why am I so engaged in this? And for a lot of my clients, some of the behavior that they're engaged in, it's not that they necessarily like it or they want it. It's a repetition of their trauma.
It is.
And
yes.
and so in their acting out, they are scarring themselves again and again. And a break from that can help them see the pain that's underneath that. And then if they choose, if they want that behavior to be a part of their healthy sexuality, they can certainly choose that. And they can learn how to engage in it from a place of authenticity and a place of presence, instead of this place of dissociation where they're just showing up to get brutalized again.
You know, when somebody is coming through a process of getting rid of a substance addiction and they're admitting to a place like this, like Brighton, where, you know, their whole lives are structured and everything is just worked out to the T, really, those sexual compulsivity issues are the only ones they still have access to. So when I even kind of sort of hint that reset may be necessary, there is this like
over
demon,
my dead body.
yes, that like comes out, and so I've had to learn to do that very carefully and cautiously and, you know, systematically. Yeah. But the thing is that is absolutely the starting point, because nobody really understands how much this controls their lives until they've tried to do something like that. And typically it's a 90-day abstinence period. That's the average. And, you know, when somebody has gone through that experience, only at the end of it can you really understand.
Yeah. And they can say it was worth it.
Kind of like recovery from substances. Right. Once your brain is clear, then you can say, oh yeah, that wasn't good for me. When the whole time you're doing it, you're thinking you've got it handled and it's under control.
And I think that's a general principle of mindfulness and healthy living. Like, it doesn't have to be something that can necessarily be addictive or destructive. I think breaks and mindful breaks are really important in keeping our intention focused on what we want, and evaluating what has value and what doesn't in our lives.
Absolutely.
I love to take 90-day breaks from my family of origin. Like, that's really good for me.
90-day breaks from your employment.
Yes. Oh, I'd love that. Got to figure that one out.
Yeah, I'm working on that one.
Yeah, no, I was going to add on this. We got into this around the different opinions on sex addiction, or what is the
sexual compulsivity.
Sexual compulsivity would be the other way. They wouldn't call it addiction.
Right.
And I think this brings into question what is addiction. And, you know, as a recovering guy and now as a counselor, you know, I look for powerlessness and unmanageability without question. And if you've got powerlessness and unmanageability, and in most cases, Dr. Carnes and the Big Book of AA state clearly that addicts, alcoholics, any addicts, tend to be, on average, very capable, highly successful people in some way. So they've got this glaring difference of maybe an enormous amount of success in discipline and self-will in all of these other areas, business or whatever it is, sports or whatever it is they do. And then they have complete, to the point of almost killing themselves and others, powerlessness and unmanageability around, let's say, sex. And so for those of us who have lived it, in my case, and all those thousands of AA meetings and NA and Al-Anon and S meetings, and seen that powerlessness and unmanageability, it's difficult for me to call it anything but addiction. And what's the point? Why does it matter? Well, what it matters is because the solution to addiction is what tends to work for these people. And so and I think with regards to the ASECT and the other groups, I agree. From what I can tell, there's the majority of the stuff I agree with. I think it's like any political issue or political group. There's a lot of gray area, and then there's people that are extreme.
And there is a lot of politicalization around this issue on both ends. I think there's, I hate to paint this as a conservative versus liberal thing, but I think there's a lot of conservative groups that are very reticent around anything sexual and can over control, over instill fear.
Yeah.
And likewise, on the other side with the liberals, they are so free-flowing and don't hold me back and let's make this what it is and not make it bad, that they lose sight of when it does get dysfunctional.
And I think the thing that doesn't work about the argument in general is you can't define for an entire population what works for them and what doesn't. It is an individual thing.
Every time.
Yeah, I've had clients walk into my office who have said, I think I have a problem with pornography, and we get in and we explore it, and it's really not a problem with pornography, and it's not because they're not using it a lot, it's because that's not the issue. Like, that's the manifestation of the issue. So we work on what the issue is, and all of a sudden, like, pornography has snapped into where they want it to be in their life, not overrunning and overreaching.
And not doing the thing like you're talking about with the sugar, where it's like feast or famine.
Yeah.
You know, I have to cut it out completely in order to be a healthy, functioning individual in my life.
Well, and that's that historically around recovery from addiction, alcohol and drugs, is the definition of sober is complete abstinence. Well, we don't have that with food and sex and money. We got to live with those things.
And then that's one of the big criticisms, is it can't be an addiction because abstinence can't be the solution. And abstinence is not the solution. Abstinence is a step in the process.
Well, and then
sometimes.
And then another topic of what is addiction, and Cameron, you were starting to touch on this, and I hesitate because this thing can go way in deep, is around brain science, okay? And brain science is, in the last 20 years, we've learned an enormous amount of, and the certification that the three of us have or are working towards is very much in the center of that research, brain science. And Dr. Carnes, the founder of all of this stuff, says just flat out, addiction is a brain disease, pure and simple, with the developmental immaturity issues from childhood trauma.
The fact that it is a brain disease, and then those two components of powerlessness and unmanageability, if you combine that, the result that you get, the end of that equation, is unbearable consequences. And that's what brings people into our office. That brings people into treatment. If you don't have those unbearable consequences and your life isn't feeling like it's crushing you, you're still going to think you're doing just fine, and you're going to numb out.
And you may be just fine for that moment.
Right.
I don't think
just fine according to cultural standards.
That's true too.
Yeah, I don't think that everyone who's engaged in some kind of problematic sexual behavior has this day of reckoning that's looming in the distance. Sometimes that never comes.
It's true. But it is an undercurrent.
Right.
It's something that like slowly puts that pressure, basically, you know, on the core of your being, that says, this is going to kill me. It may not have a day of reckoning, but you don't get rid of it except during those moments of acting out, probably. And even then, you're just digging the hole deeper.
Yeah, and as I look back, when I described my history in that long-term marriage and being sober, I mean, I look back now, and as the big book of AA was describing, that I should be experiencing a new level of happiness,
the fourth
joy,
dimension
and
of
freedom,
existence,
and the fourth
right?
dimension.
Yes.
And I had a great enough improvement that I kind of thought, but as I look back, I was so anxious, and I had such a quick anger streak, and that was all stuff that wasn't necessary. If ultimately I did started to dig deeper and look at it, and I'm like an almost entirely different person inside now. You know, I have to keep doing what I got to do every day, or I can slip back. But that's so it's there doesn't have to be huge consequences to take a look again at how am I really doing.
That's right.
Just because I'm not drinking and doing drugs.
But that's
how is
the
my
thing.
marriage? You know,
When you do heal in the way you're talking about, your sensitivity to those issues is heightened exponentially.
Well,
it
and
is,
You
but they
feel
don't
it.
they don't rule you.
That's right.
I noticed one of the things in my own recovery is it's almost like, I probably couldn't pinpoint the day on the calendar, but it's almost like I woke up one day and it's like, I could have a life that I enjoy, or I could have a life that I'm excited about. And, the first program I went to was just sobriety focused, and I got sober. And I learned to be really afraid of a lot of things that could possibly be connected to relapse. And I lived that way for probably 5 years after.
That sounds miserable.
It was an improvement from where I was at, but then there was eventually this time I was like, why am I still so angry? why do my relationships not seem to work? And that's when it was a sex addiction recovery program, and that's when I had to look at, like, it's not just about getting sexually sober. Like, I need to figure out what I want and need to be saying yes to. And that's where a lot like your experience, Arch, like anger shifted, relationship shifted, and it's a work in progress. I think that's something for any addict in recovery. It's a lifestyle that you're going to incorporate, not a program that you're going to finish or some steps that you're going to complete. You're learning a new way of living that supports the kind of growth and the kind of health that you want and deserve.
I would say one of the most significant ways that shift has manifested in my life in recent years with this deeper work is around boundaries. And in fact, I don't think there's anything more fundamentally occurring to me at this late stage in recovery as how clueless I was about how to intuitively be able to navigate boundaries, my own and others, in my workplace and in my family life and in my social circles, in my recovery world. That was missing. With 25 plus years of sobriety in AA, I was not at all intuitive about boundaries. And what was, of course, under that, John, was the trauma work. I was walking around, and sex addiction, another thing Karen says, and we know this, there's 4 core beliefs that we have that are typically 4 ones, and sex is my greatest need, I'm unworthy, I'll never be loved, something like that.
If I have to rely on other people to meet my needs will not be met.
Yep. And I was walking around with decades of sobriety from chemicals with that stuff still underneath. And I was trying to make it up with making more money and flirting and not being present in my marriage. I don't mind sharing with you, our sex life was non-existent. And actually I came out of the deeper work that I've done in recent years realizing that I didn't have a clue about what sex could be. And I'd had before I got married, I had sex with 200 women.
Well, and that's interesting.
And I didn't have a clue, and it was not at all healthy, meaningful sex. None of it.
There's a couple ways I've heard that explained that make a lot of sense to me. Sex addicts, for people who use their bodies a lot, they're not connected to their bodies. Somebody explained it to me once as they're inhabiting 20% of their mass, their head, and the rest of it, it's like it doesn't matter. And then, you have these sex addicts who come in for treatment, and they've been with a lot of people, and they're very skilled, very proficient, but they're terrified of the act, and they're terrified of the intimacy that comes along with that. So they're really not that good at sex.
Interesting. And that's why I love this whole movement, the Porn Kills Love movement, because it goes so much deeper than just an activity or something that we're doing. It's what is taking you out of your body, what is taking you out of your mind, what is killing that intimacy potential that you have inside of you that you're not accessing because you are engaging in things that are shutting that off.
What I'm thinking right now that, some young 22-year-old guy who's on a roll listening to this thinking, oh yeah, just what I want is to be in love with my girl walking down, and I'm not, it's just... Unless
you're a sex and love addict.
Yeah.
that's all you want.
Well, and that's what I thought I had, but it wasn't what was happening. I had to have some consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do want to go back to something you were saying, John, because you just briefly mentioned it, but I think it needs a bit more attention, is I was saying yes to thing, or how did you say it? I was saying yes to recovery.
I knew what I needed to say no to. I had no idea what I needed to be saying yes to.
Yes. So the saying yes piece, that positive sobriety, because what Arch is describing over here is a negative sobriety. What you touched on there was the positive aspect of that, which most people don't get to for the first 3 to 5 years because they don't know that it's even there.
And I would say too, like, there's a lot of no's to clear up in
so
that time,
many no's,
and it can be really hard to focus on the yeses without, like, that was a big part for me. I was afraid of saying yes to things that felt good in my body, because what felt good in my body before was addiction and self-betrayal. And so I didn't feel like I could trust my body.
Right.
So I think it took some time for the dust to settle on that before I could start saying maybe I want something a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it was a very tentative stepping into that.
Mm-hmm. The saying yes piece to me is what I see the most. So, like I was saying earlier, if people start changing jobs, people start taking up hobbies, people are going out into the world and saying, you know what, I don't want to be miserable and unhappy anymore. Regardless of what that looks like, the peace that I feel now is more important than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more important than this conflict. It's more important than that failed marriage that I've thought about every day for the last 30 years. That peace becomes the goal, and that yes becomes the driving factor.
And I think a lot of addicts early in recovery will feel like my addiction was saying yes to a lot and recovery is saying no. I think it's actually the opposite, because what drives addiction is we're saying no to vulnerability. Yeah. We're saying no to intimacy. We're saying no to risk, which are all things that totally burned us, right? Like
trust.
We're saying no to trust.
Issue, yeah.
So particularly when it comes to sex and love addiction, there's a high degree of control that's going on, and it floors most of my clients when we start talking about their control. And I'll say things like, gosh, that was really controlling. Well, I'm not a controlling person. It's like, oh yes, let's go down that rabbit hole.
Exactly.
Because that's really at the heart of it. There's so much fear about getting hurt, getting wounded, being left exposed, that the life is lived under such tight control that nothing can grow there. Oh. It strangles anything good that could come out of that.
Yeah.
So as we're talking, I'm doing what Arch is doing and thinking of the 22-year-old stallion that's out there sowing his wild oats, and then the person who's been in a 30-year marriage and is trying to figure out, like, why am I so miserable? Both of them can relate to that misery, but how would you say someone would be able to acknowledge or recognize and say, I think that's me? Where does that reflection lead them in our direction?
The first thing that's coming to mind for me is, in sex addiction, there's actually two sides to it. There's the addiction, and then there's the anorexia side. Both are completely focused on sex as a way to get relief. The addict is looking for the next opportunity, the next conquest, the next orgasm. The anorexic is focused on sex and avoiding it at all costs. So I think one of the ways that you may start identifying with it is it feels like there's a lot of focus on what my next experience is going to be or not going to be. Like, this is taking up a lot of my mental, emotional bandwidth. Or whenever I'm engaged with sex, I'm so far disconnected from my body that it's not really an experience that I'm involved in. It's an experience that my body has shown up for.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, I think there's also one of the interventions we do as therapists in this ITAP community is we do a sexual and relationship timeline. So if from this podcast or at any point somebody's got a little stirring inside, like, I wonder, which is tricky, because if they're in 3 months, if they're 3 months into a hot new relationship, they're going to not be listening to any of this, because life is good. And it just hasn't gotten to the point where they realize they're with another person, and that person actually has strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
But I think a therapist-guided sexual and relationship timeline, or just some sort of a process, maybe with a sponsor, to sit down and just look honestly as possible at the history of relationships and sex. I think that can maybe motivate someone to head to a meeting, or get a hold of a book.
And ITAP, I know they do just a quick questionnaire online.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, it's free.
It's free. You can Google it under "Am I a Sex Addict?"
Or it's recoveryzone.com, right?
And
but you can actually pull it up that way.
The test is the sex addiction or the sexual addiction screening test, the SAST.
SAST, yeah.
And that I think would be an important point to bring up, Arch, when you were talking. It was making me think, as sex addiction therapists, we're not guessing whether or not people are sex addicts. We actually use very sophisticated assessments. They're normed, they're reliable. So we can get a picture of, is this sex addiction or not? And if it is sex addiction, I always tell my clients there's a wide range of behaviors and a wide range of intensity. So we can know exactly what type of sex addiction we're dealing with, which is important because it's not just about becoming sexually sober. It's about healing the relational wounds under that. And the behavior itself tells us a lot about what that wound might be.
Yep.
So when you whether you're taking the SAST on your own or you're working with a certified sex addiction therapist to explore this, you're not just stumbling around in the dark seeing what lands.
Yes.
There's very specific things that we look at that come from your story.
And that's comforting because, I mean, so many other diagnostic criterion has the potential of being interpreted through the lens of the facilitator.
Yeah.
And so, I think you have this, I'm the expert, so you do. This one, I think it's been empirically studied, hasn't it? Like
it has,
cross-culturally,
actually,
intergenerationally.
They use the SDI, the Sexual Dependency Inventory, to help norm the MMPI, which is like the most widely used personality test.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I know that when people come into Brighton, we work as a team. And so if one of my colleagues is like, hey, I'm starting to see that this might be a thing, they'll send me the information and I'll get them those tests.
Yeah.
And we will run them through that. And if they are, and that becomes a primary focus, we will then make sure that they're getting sessions with me so that I can handle it from that certified sex addiction standpoint and know those interventions like you're talking about, Arch, where, depending on what the issue is, because it's so individualized, we have places to go. Like, it's not just an assessment. When you certify in this field, you have access to resources that are just overwhelming in their ability to address these kinds of things.
And interestingly, on that point, it's pretty clear to me, and I think many, that the sex addiction treatment arena, led still by Dr. Carnes, and I'll tell you why in a moment, is really leading much of the current research on all addiction. In fact, he just was awarded the Fulbright Scholarship within the last year, which is amazing. And he's doing a genome study, and he's in his 70s. And this guy, what I'm told is he founded SAA. He's 40 some years a sober sex addict, and he's a PhD. And his daughter, Stephanie Carnes, they run this program we're talking about, ITAP and our CSAT certification. So they came through the ranks of arguably the most successful addiction treatment program that exists, which is 12 Steps. And now they're leading the charge in the scientific study.
Yeah.
So it's
neat.
kind of an added bonus when you become a sex addict in recovery.
There's perks.
You're no longer just an alcoholic. You're on the wave of the most sophisticated studies.
Well, I feel that way as a therapist. I mean, when I had the whole world open to me, like you were saying in the beginning, John, no, I didn't set out for that. I didn't set out to be a sex addiction therapist. But what I learned is I went through the ITAP process and learned about trauma and all those underlying issues, is that if I got certified in this realm, that umbrella services all those substance and behavior addictions below it in a way that I couldn't get anywhere else.
Yeah.
I couldn't say no to this certification because of how all-encompassing and inclusive that it was in that regard.
Well, and this same organization does a multiple addictions certificate, which you have, I think.
I've gotten the financial and work disorders part of that, and
Jackie's got that.
There's an eating disorders part, and there's a substance abuse part that I have yet to do. But I have I think I have the next 15 years of training mapped out.
That's great. Yeah, that's what I love about you, John. You just never stop.
I need to stop.
If you did,
I have a problem.
Yes, we found another addiction.
But I remember back in the 80s and early 90s when I was newer in recovery from my alcohol and drug addiction, the books that were the books you had to read were on inner child. There was Claudia Black and John Bradshaw, and actually Dr. Carnes wrote his first book in the late 80s or mid 80s. And so long before ITAP and these certifications and trainings that we have were available, they were pointing to this kind of stuff as being the underlying issues for addiction, childhood trauma, and the roles that we played in the family system.
I want to talk about that for a minute, because I think the roots of addiction go back to childhood, no matter who you are.
Yeah.
Like you may not have picked up your first drug or had your first encounter with problematic sex when you were a child, but the attachment wounds that are there and the family of origin stuff, like you said, Arch, there are two things that kids can get reliably to soothe themselves when parents aren't available for that, and that's food and masturbation. And
spending at a certain age,
right, when you start getting access to that. But there's it really, any addiction in my belief is in service of soothing the self and emotionally regulating the self, and we go with what we know is reliable and available.
And that's not, I mean, certainly we have overt abuse as children, the terrible instances of sexual abuse from a parent or physical abuse. But, you know, if mommy and daddy are screaming every night and you're 5 years old shaking in your room, you know, that's abuse. Yeah. That's abuse that stays in there.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, and there's
Well, you were talking about books a minute ago. I was really hoping you would go here, so I'm going to force you here. The aspects of this childhood trauma that we're talking about, and then how that shows up as an adult, I think is handled really, really well in that Bible that you and your wife read every day. Would you mind sharing what connections you see there and how that's helped you?
Thank you so much, Cameron. And actually your question a while ago about how to, I forget exactly how you put it, but how people who are curious can begin to see if there's something they need to look more closely at in this area of sex and love and intimacy disorder. It's anybody listening who's been in long-term recovery, we have our little morning readers a day at a time, depending on the program, right? The different ones that fit the different programs. I still do the one from AA that I've done forever, and Al-Anon has one. But this book around sex and love and intimacy, written by Alex Katahakis, Mirror of Intimacy. And actually, I've gotten to know her a little bit, and she said, accurately, she said, "Be careful who you give this book to."
It is so true.
Right, you
remember what happened? I'm like a relationship whore. Like that's my thing. I love intimacy. I love getting connected and all of that. And I opened it up, and it was like,
because I brought it to a training to have her sign the hardcover.
That's right.
Alex
and
was
he's like, check this out. So I opened it up, and I mean, I literally felt my entire being just go shrink.
And you shot it and handed it
and
back.
I was like, I'm done. I can't go there. I'm sorry.
So it's got a reading for every day, like all readers.
Sorry, that's not to discourage people from reading it. It's just saying it's very deep.
Yeah.
Very.
Yeah. And
it takes you to places that if you're not ready for.
Right. And what I'm about to say is, man, challenge yourself. If you're in a relationship and you think you're healthy and ready for a relationship, ask your partner to read this book every morning with coffee with you. And it just really, know that.
Yeah, I can't believe how many aspects of relationship and wounds she catches there.
It's deep. I told her I thought it was like inspired, almost like the Big Book thing. I mean, it's just crazy. We still read it every night or morning.
But talk about the connection, because you're talking about childhood trauma, and I think she covers that really well as you move through that. And you just mentioned it too, like she's catching it. What are you noticing that she's catching?
Yeah, well, she's each day has a topic. Last night was happiness, and and then some of them are about sex, eroticism or something. And so you kind of think you know where it's headed. And she has a little quote from very famous authors and philosophers that kind of sets the tone. And then you begin to read it, and it's about daily life and relationships, and it ties back. It connects current relationship happenings with patterns that we know to be common among addicts, and from childhood family trauma and dysfunction. And then at the end, there's she titles it Daily Healthy Sex Acts, but as you learn when you're in recovery from this, and as both of you have talked about, this is another thing Karen says, is sex addiction is nothing more than an intimacy disorder.
That's right.
And these daily healthy sex acts, I would say 90% of the time, they're about how, there's usually 2 or 3 of them, about things you can do, and they're like intimacy builders. They're like talk to your spouse about, sometimes they're about sex, talk to your spouse about how she likes to be. This one would be about sex, how she likes to be touched, or something like that. Instead of, and I look back at my whole sexual history, I was in control of every single sexual experience. Yeah. Well, that's no way to have meaningful, healthy sex.
That's great for you.
I don't know. No, I would say it's not. I thought it was.
The illusion of it being great.
Well,
Exactly.
and that's what I love about this book, is that it isn't something for someone who's just starting the process, like you were talking about, and getting rid of all the no's. It's for someone that's been through the no's, and it's like, okay, like,
now how do I do a yes?
I am so ready for a life of yeses.
It's a yes book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. That's really good.
And that's why I brought it up, is because I know that's what's next for a lot of people. And you don't have to be struggling with a sex addiction to get the most out of this
it's
book.
Relationship development and enhancement.
And I think the thing that it captures really well, Dr. Karn says our sexuality is the deepest expression of the deepest parts of us. And I absolutely believe that's true. And this book really gets at those deep parts that you'd say that's not related to sex at all. But it is, because sex is how those deep parts of us are manifest. And one of my favorite entries, I was reading this with a group probably a couple years ago. It was about integrity. And, we hear a lot of integrity from 12-step groups and things like that. And she related it architecturally, and she said that integrity means that it's built with a purpose and it's built strong from the core out. And then she talked about like medieval fortresses and castles, how those were built with integrity and they could withstand sieges, and they could provide safety for what was inside while assault was happening on the outside. And she talked about how in addiction, we're not built with integrity. We're built so that the inside can match whatever's outside, because that's how we survive. So she talks about getting to the core and building with purpose and building with mindfulness and building with intent, so that we have this strong being that no matter what's going on outside, we can be safe and we can be whole. And that's an aspect, like, if you're just looking at getting sober in your sexuality, integrity doesn't matter. If you're looking,
or even in substance,
right?
Yeah.
If you're looking at having a life,
behavioral modification, and not true internal shift.
Yeah, and that's I think really with I believe that I'm doing my sex addicts a disservice if we end treatment when they're sober. Because we really need to get to this stuff, like who's the person there.
Term called the dry drunk.
Yeah, and that's the starting point. When they're sober, now we can work with you.
Right? I told a client of mine, we've been working together for over a year, and soon after we started working together, she was a year sober, and she kind of like took her foot off the gas, and I was like, no, like there's trauma work. And she's like, what? I thought I was doing the painful stuff. I was like, no, this is the reward for getting sober. Now you get to look at your trauma and we get to heal from that. And she's been doing really amazing work on that. It's been very painful, but she's emerging as this strong person who knows herself and loves herself.
I just got all warm and fuzzy when you were talking, hey, John. No, I'm serious, because
he does that to me too.
Right here. You were talking, and I was thinking insides matching outsides.
Yeah.
And how that is when they talk about the spiritual awakening in the 12th step, I think that it's as evident in that occurrence where we in recovery feel like we can be transparent and authentic, and it's coming naturally, and we start to realize. I'm working with a guy right now who's stated just beautifully in a meeting. He says, I don't know, he's 50 years old, I don't know who I am or what I want in life. Never have.
Yeah.
And that's the and I'm thinking of another person who probably at this point almost all the viewers, oh man,
I'm so sorry,
almost all the viewers know of Brené Brown.
Yeah.
And her TED Talk on vulnerability and some of her books and things. But I think that really hits on the same sort of stuff we're talking about: authenticity and the freedom that brings, and the joy, freedom and joy in being able to connect with others from a space of truthfulness and just comfort with who we are.
Of all of the people that sit in my office, and I'm sitting across from them, and I give them the layout of the land. Here is the landscape of the territory that you are about to enter, and it's as detailed as I can make it so that I can open their eyes and show them what's ahead and get them, you know, kind of excited, but more just aware of what's going on from maybe a topographical map view. And what I've noticed through that process is the number one response to that revelation is, it's going to take that long. Yeah. Like why even try is the next thought that never exits the mouth, right? But you know it's there. It's like, then why even take this first step if I know I'm going to have to take that many more after it? Right. When all of my needs have always been met after that first step, right? With the reliability of the behavior or drug. And it's so hard. It's my greatest professional frustration to give someone even just a glimpse of that vision without crushing their soul.
It's interesting. In the last 3 weeks, we've had quite a few over 70s come into our office. And so we have this little geriatric wing now that we're
Send
working
them all
with.
To you, right?
I'm working with 2 of them.
Nice.
That's cool.
It has been, it's been really interesting to work with. One guy said, I think I only have 2 years left. And he first came in and he said, I'm doing no more than 4 sessions. I want to know what to do to stop looking at internet pornography. And I said, okay, I'll meet you where you're at. Like,
that's right.
And we assessed and we got a sobriety plan together. And in the last session, we were talking about what some of the underlying things of his addiction are and what work there might be. And he said, I may only have 2 years left. Like, is it even worth it to work on that? Because we were talking about trauma from childhood sexual abuse. And I said, let me ask you this. If one of your children were terminally ill and you knew they only had 2 years left, and you knew that there were some things that could greatly improve their quality of life and happiness in those 2 years, would you want them to have it? And he couldn't answer the question in the session. And that was our last session. And he said, well, maybe I'll come back every month so that we can check in. He called me a week later and he said, I need to come in soon and I need a plan for working on this.
Oh, good.
Nice
working on the
work,
abuse,
John.
because I want to be happy. And his spouse is saying the same thing. She was asked why now, and she said, I just want to be happy for for some part of my life. And I think when we look at that, like I have 2 children, and when I look at how long I'm going to be parenting them, like I'm not going to be done with that. Yeah. You know, there's going to be some role there, but I look at them and I look at how beautiful they are and how happy they are and what amazing people they are, and I'm happy to give them that time. And I think that's one of the big blocks for a lot of addicts in recovery is you talked about that inner child work. I think that we see our inner child as worthless, as worthy of abuse. You nailed it. And when we start to see, like, I'm a human being that deserves some time and investment as well, I think that's when, like, for me, it doesn't matter how long I'm going to be spending money on recovery or working on recovery. I actually keep a picture of myself. I was probably about 5 years old, playing AYSO soccer. I was in these fantastic, like, red and yellow striped shorts. It was probably a swimsuit and this green soccer jersey. And I'm standing there with the shorts, like, hiked up to my chest and standing by a ball. I keep that picture close because I need to look at that kid and I need to remember what it felt like to be him and what he needed.
In all seriousness, that you're as precious and inherently valuable today as you were then. Yeah. And isn't that where we hope to get with the vast majority of our clients, to where they can have that sort of love and care for themselves
that they wish they would have had at that age,
and to see the patterns in which they're running from the pain around that. Or, I mean, how often do we see people marrying their mom?
Does anyone not marry their mom?
Can you?
I didn't.
I did. I married my mom the first time. I don't think this time.
Now it's your dad.
Yeah.
You only have 2 choices, man. Pick one.
How much did that cost? That you just told me that, Mr. Therapist.
You can send me the bill.
You know, and I think that movement from I'm valuable, I matter, like I look at my kids and how quick they are to say, hey, I need this or I want this. And there's part of me that will roll my eyes and be like, you ungrateful little turd, you don't recognize it. And then there's another part that's like, I'm really glad that you don't feel any blocks to saying, here I am, here's what I need. And I hope that they can keep that alive. But
I like that.
That change happens so imperceptibly over time. Sometimes with clients, I'll run them through this thought experiment, because when I'll say things like, no, you have value, they'll say, no, I don't. Everybody else doesn't. I've done X, Y, Z, and that's why I don't have value. So I'll run them through this thought experiment. I'll say, imagine we're in some dystopian future and you're a doctor and your job is to go through the maternity ward, go through the nursery, and you need to determine which children will amount to nothing and which ones are worth us investing in. And I said, I want you to imagine going by the rows of cradles and deciding who gets to live and who gets to die. And they said,
"You're sadistic."
Well, I've had clients say, like, that is gross. Like, that's dark. And yeah, I know it's gross and dark, but think about it.
So is your thought. Yeah.
Right. And they'll say, you can't. And I said, okay, yeah, babies, it's hard to do that with. Let's go to a kindergarten class. Why don't you go to kindergarten class? They're learning how to read. They're learning how to write. You can watch them play on the playground. Surely then you can determine who's worth investing in and who's not. And sometimes, like, depending on where that client's trauma started, sometimes they'll say, like, oh, yeah, I could do that with the kindergarten class.
Telling, yeah.
But a lot of times they're like, I couldn't do that. Okay, well, let's take a room of sixth graders. Let's take a room of juniors in high school. Let's go to a college. Like, where's the line? And generally what they end up feeling is there's not a line where I started being worthless.
Right.
That was what I started to believe. That's the story I started to tell myself because I heard it or I felt it from my environment, but my inherent worth never changed.
That's powerful.
Right. And there's a built-in understandable defensiveness and loyalty to parents and family system.
Even if they're abusive.
Well, and
almost always if they're abusive.
Yeah, and they are almost always abusive. I mean, and then there's the cultural abuse.
Yeah.
So, so we battle that as we're working with clients, and I was challenged with that in my recovery process to realize that it isn't a blame game to look back, with knowledgeable and skilled guidance through people like us and reading the right books and attending the right meetings. I need to look back. I need to look back accurate and see the accurate truth of the matter. And it's not a blame game. In fact, whatever didn't work from my parents, they just learned and carried forward from their parents and environment.
It's naming, and I think
it holds us back. It owns us with our patterns today around sex, money, drugs.
Yeah, and we have to be able to name it because names have power. And I think naming for a lot of the sex addicts I work with, when they can say sex addiction is me and they can understand even just a sliver of what that entails and they can see how deep it goes, just giving it that name empowers them to do something about it.
I love that piece of it because, you know, people coming through nowadays, I don't know what shift is happening in the world right now, but what I see so prevalent in this demographic is this idea that I am not going to assume a label. I am not an addiction. I am not going to go into a room and say that I am this disease. And what I struggle with is what I see you talking about here is that empowerment that comes when you do. And then Arch, what you said.
Completely paradoxical.
It is. And then Arch, a couple of topics ago, you were saying the same thing, is like, once I had that, now I know what to do with it. And if we don't go there, and if we allow society to tell us that, oh, we are better than that, we miss such a key component of that powerlessness that has kind of been the overarching support to the entire discussion. Because without that, nobody pulls out of this disease.
Right. And then that just triggered a related topic, which is the use of medications, psychiatric medications, which in many cases is supported and done responsibly and professionally. At the same time, how quickly that can be the patch and the solution, that people go to. And that can be an extraordinarily tangled mess that ends up going on for forever. And I think it can mask and damp down the type of work and discovery and healing that we're talking about here. So I just want to, mention that as a cautionary note, that there's well-intentioned professionals out there that don't, for whatever reasons, won't be the best source to go to with what is an organic problem. It's a touchy subject, but I think it's worth mentioning.
And that makes me think, in my own experience, there was a time that I was psychiatrically medicated, and had that gone on longer than I needed, that would have been really damaging. Just like I think my addiction, I think I got out of addiction before a lot of damage could have happened. But it provided this buffer that I needed to survive.
Right.
Without it, I don't think, like, even I tell my clients early on, there's going to come a day where you're going to look back at your addiction, you're going to be grateful that it exists, and they'll be like,
that is so true.
You might be too crazy for me to work with.
That's right.
That is so true.
But you
they
look
call
at
it the gift of desperation.
It is. And seriously, when people who have been in recovery long enough to get that, wake up to that ideal, it's almost like, how does anyone exist in this world without having gone through something like that?
Yeah.
Because, I have a discussion with a friend all the time that says, we have such amazing lives right now, like both of us. And I think all of us at the table can join that discussion as well. Just like everything we could have ever imagined happening right now, and how grateful we are for that. But we don't stop to thank the part of us that made that possible.
Right.
And that was this darkness, that was this struggle, that was everything that we pushed through to earn a place at that table. Because like with anything, and my favorite analogy is working out, you don't just say, I want to be fit, and then walk in the gym and then look around and say, well, why hasn't it happened yet?
Is that why it's not working?
John, I've been telling you this for years. So, I mean, you really can't get through to a part of the brain that hasn't come online yet with a part of the brain that has. So someone who's in long-term recovery, they're functioning out of much more of that accessibility than someone who is just starting. And those two can't connect until they're both online. And that's a really important concept to understand.
And I would say to that person starting in recovery, don't get discouraged because it's not there, because it'll happen.
It always does.
It's amazing to see what the brain can do if given even remotely ideal conditions to function in. And that's what your recovery is doing for you, whether it's recovery from sex or drugs or food. You're giving your brain a little more ideal conditions to grow in, and it's amazing what grows out of that.
And what book, you actually recommended a book to me that I read recently about the plasticity.
My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor, was that it?
No.
Bessel van der Kolk?
What was the name of the
Body
book?
Keeps the Score?
Was it in that one? Because I was thinking
talks
that
a lot
one.
about it in there.
Okay, maybe it was that one. But just, how plastic the brain really is, and how most of us are functioning out of the paradigm that, I'm killing brain cells and there's holes in my brain and I'm never going to get through this. But how even people who've had like pipes stuck through their head can have the function of that part of their brain moved to the other hemisphere, and the brain will actually create neuroreceptors that do the same thing. That this is not hopeless. Like, it feels like it. It feels like it's the end of the world. It feels like everything is just going to be this big, long, endless struggle. But the addiction couldn't survive if it didn't convince you of that.
Right.
And to really separate from it is one of life's greatest and most rewarding challenges.
I don't think there are any bigger payoffs than what we're talking about here. We're talking about shifts in meaning and purpose in life. And yet, when we as clinicians say, okay, there's not only no sex for 90 days, there's no dating.
Right.
I mean,
let's just shoot you now.
The 22-year-old stud who goes to AA meetings looking for women, and he happens to hear a little bit about a step once in a while. He's not too excited about no dating. So did you flirt this week? But I'm being silly, but the brain needs to right. The brain and on this topic, when you talked about what's the porn? It's a
Porn Kills Love.
Yeah. There was a cover front page Time magazine thing a couple of years ago about pornography, and it centered around Utah, actually, and we're one of the leading countries in terms of the movement against or trying to point out the damage.
And by some surveys, the movement for porn.
Right. Okay.
That's
Love
true.
that.
It's
One
the
of the-
counterculture. Don't
Yeah.
forget them.
But one of the most powerful things in that article that I've come to learn in my studies is that it's especially damaging, lifetime damage in some cases, except for the brain has plasticity, for young men, and erectile dysfunction and sexual dysfunction by the time they're in their mid-20s. I mean, which is just unheard of. But the rate of that happening is like substantial. It's basically become the sex education
It is.
for these young men and women. But the young men, this is what sex and love is. This is what I should be expecting in my marriage, my first marriage, and my girlfriend. And of course, the porn scene is not reality.
Yeah, exactly.
And their brain.
And that's all that's the entire clientele that's rising up to fill our offices right now. Yeah, it's being created as we speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really sad. Well, I think we should probably wrap up. I want to know, though, first, before we do, what message you guys want to give to our listeners. What is that part of you that brought you here today that said, this is what I want to make sure that I get across in this podcast? If you want them to take something away, what would that be?
I'll go first. I'm always excited to talk to a group of people who are committed to improving themselves and trying to do that. I think the message that I would part with is whether or not addiction became part of your life was going to be a big intertangled spider web that at some point you needed to figure out some parts of. It was never meant to go smoothly. And like we were talking about earlier, and Arch was saying, the gift of desperation. One of the gifts that your addiction brings you now is that you not only get to focus on very specific parts of that spider web, but you have awesome support to do that.
Yeah.
Like there is an endless supply of books. There's an endless supply of people. There are an endless supply of groups, podcasts and lots of things that are there to help you untangle it. And it's a day by day thing. And I can say with a great degree of confidence that there will be a day. This is one of my favorite Patrick Carnes ideas, that there's a day that you'll wake up and you'll have problems that aren't related to sex or aren't related to your addiction, and that will be a good day.
It will be.
And it happens. Just find a path, get on it, and do what you can to stay on it, and I promise life gets better.
Thanks, John. That's beautiful.
Yeah, and my thought would be very much along the same lines. That I went for many years, of course that was, back in the 80s and 90s, but afraid to move outside of AA for any help. I was terrified because I did not, which was, that served me well as far as not drinking.
Yeah.
But I would say now, in the big book, the phrase is more will be revealed. And I think what we're talking about here and what's available, I mean, there's over 200 12-step programs, and then there's tremendous stuff in the world of therapy available in books. And I think what I've been finding is, I'm on another pink cloud at 33 years sober. It's crazy. As you described, Cameron, my life is just unbelievable. And what I'd like to share with people who are anxious, 2, 3, 5 years sober from substances, is everything I've found, as long as I stay grounded with my sponsor and in my home group and I stay connected there, everything I've found that's been helpful ties into one or more steps and principles in the program.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing to be afraid of. And then to practice being open-minded and trusting of sources that are safe.
Thanks, Arch. I appreciate that very much. Well, I thank you all, both, for being here. I think the greatest part of having folks like you in is to really highlight the continuity of care that we all as clinicians try to facilitate for our clients. If you're seeing somebody in your offices that you're like, wow, this is bigger than what I can do on a once a week basis, you step them up to some place like Brighton.
Yeah.
If we're discharging somebody, we know that Healing Pass in Bountiful is out there, and Red Willow Counseling and Recovery is in Park City and in Salt Lake. We know that there are places that these people can go, and staying in touch. I know that I've collaborated with you with clients that I've sent you in the past, and just being able to keep in touch and then to say, oh, he may be needing a refresher, let's send him back. All of that kind of stuff is so important in that process, because it's not a one and done, or it's not a perfect, step-by-step process. I do this, I get that. But it is, like you're talking about, having that support around you to know that no matter how many zigzags you make within that circle of trust and support, that you're still supported. Mm-hmm. There's a million places you could go, but there's nowhere that you could go that's outside of that, as long as you stay plugged in. And so I think this podcast highlights that more than anything. And I appreciate you guys being out here and taking your time. I know that it takes a lot to do in a busy work day, but I think the dividends will pay off exponentially. So we appreciate you coming out today. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron.
So thank you for joining us today. If you like this podcast, please join us on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Make sure to rate us and let people know that we're doing a good job. We appreciate you listening today, and look forward to hearing from you in multiple capacities. Have a great day.